Over the Tunisian desert on that first day of February in 1943, at an altitude where the air grew thin and oxygen masks became absolutely necessary, Lieutenant Harry C. Nuezel bent over his navigation charts with practiced concentration. His pencil moved across the paper, marking their course back to safety, though the condensation forming on his mask made the numbers swim slightly before his eyes. He calculated they had 17 minutes remaining before they'd be beyond the operational range of German interceptors. Just 17 minutes until they could breathe somewhat easier, until the immediate threat would diminish to something more manageable. The warning burst through the intercom with startling urgency. The tail gunner's voice crackled through the system, reporting enemy fighters approaching from directly ahead, diving fast from superior altitude. Nuezel barely had time to process the information, barely had time to lift his eyes from his charts when he heard something that would embed itself permanently in his memory. It wasn't the sound of an explosion, nor was it the familiar hammering rhythm of machine gun fire that they'd all become accustomed to during their combat missions. Instead, what reached his ears was what he would later attempt to describe in a letter to his family as a distinctly audible swooshing sound, immediately followed by a tremendous jarring impact and then a deep, resonant whoomphing noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Looking up through the plexiglass nose section of their Boeing B-17F, designated All-American 3, Nuezel witnessed something that his mind struggled to accept as reality. Pieces of a German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter were tumbling past their aircraft, visible in distinct fragments. A wing section passed by, then chunks of the fuselage, and most surreally, the canopy complete with its iron cross-marking clearly visible as it spiraled down toward the Saharan wasteland some 5 miles beneath them. The German fighter hadn't been destroyed in any conventional sense. There had been no explosion, no fireball consuming the enemy aircraft. Instead, something far more improbable had occurred. The fighter had made physical contact with their bomber, an actual mid-air collision, and yet somehow, impossibly, they remained airborne. What Lieutenant Nuezel couldn't possibly comprehend in that moment, what none of the 10 crew members aboard could fully grasp, was that they had just become participants in what would be extensively studied and documented as one of the most remarkable incidents in the entire history of aviation. Their aircraft was continuing to fly despite having its tail section nearly completely severed from the main fuselage. The connection that remained consisted of only a few metal structural spars and thin strips of aluminum skin. Within the next hour, a photograph would be taken of their damaged aircraft that would become one of the Second World War's most iconic and studied images, analysed by engineers and aviators for decades to come. The mathematics governing their continued flight seemed to violate every established principle of aerodynamics. According to everything known about aircraft design and behaviour, they should already be spiralling toward the desert in multiple pieces, their fate sealed the moment the collision occurred. Yet First Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson Bragg, Jr., gripping the control yoke with the same determination he'd demonstrated as a Duke University halfback during his legendary undefeated 1938 season, was somehow maintaining control of 65,000 pounds of severely damaged aluminum and keeping it in the air. This moment would initiate the most improbable survival story in aerial warfare history, a demonstration of American engineering excellence combined with human determination that would eventually force the German Luftwaffe to completely reassess their evaluation of the B-17 Flying Fortress and its capabilities. The 4 engines had coughed into life during the pre-dawn darkness blanketing Biskra airfield in Algeria. Their right cyclone radial engines sent vibrations through the desert sand that had managed to infiltrate every corner of the airbase. The 1st of February had arrived with unusual atmospheric clarity. There were no sandstorms brewing, wind conditions were minimal, and visibility extended as far as the eye could see. As the operations officer had noted during the pre-dawn briefing at 4 in the morning, it was perfect weather for bombing operations. First Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson Bragg, Jr., known as Sonny to those close to him, conducted his pre-flight inspection by running his hands methodically along the aircraft's control surfaces. At 25 years of age, Bragg carried himself with the quiet confidence that comes from having proven oneself in multiple demanding arenas. Back in Savannah, newspapers still discussed his performance with Duke's 1938 Iron Dukes, that remarkable team that had gone through the regular season undefeated and unscored upon, a team that had seemed invincible. The mental toughness he'd developed on the football field, that absolute refusal to accept defeat regardless of how impossible the odds appeared, had served him exceptionally well since he'd exchanged his athletic cleats for military flight boots. The Boeing B-17F-5BO, bearing serial number 4124406, had been assigned to Bragg since August 24th of the previous year. He knew this aircraft intimately, every rivet, every mechanical quirk, every distinctive sound she produced during operation. Constructed at Boeing's massive Seattle manufacturing facility, she had made the transatlantic crossing as part of Operation Bolero, the massive aerial reinforcement effort supporting the European theatre of operations. The ground crew had painted her designation in bold lettering along the nose section. All-American 3, the third aircraft to bear that hopeful name after her predecessors had been lost to the various hazards of warfare. Technical Sergeant Joe C. James, who would also man the top turret position once they reached hostile territory, reported from his station at the flight engineers panel that everything was running as smoothly as could be expected. James possessed the kind of mechanical intuition that separated merely competent engineers from truly exceptional ones. When James declared an aircraft ready for operations, that assessment could be trusted absolutely. The crew assembling that morning represented the peculiar democratic nature of the American war effort, men drawn from vastly different backgrounds and social strata, united by their training and shared purpose. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel Jr., came from a Connecticut banking family of considerable means. The navigator, Harry C. Newsell, had left his engineering studies at the University of Minnesota to enlist in the Army Air Forces. The bombardier, Ralph Burbridge, had already earned his pilot's wings before the Pearl Harbor attack, making him one of the most experienced members of the crew despite being only 23 years old. The enlisted crew members brought their own specialized expertise to the mission. Radio operator Staff Sergeant Paul A. Galloway had mastered the temperamental liaison radio equipment that maintained communication between bomber formations. The waist gunners, Staff Sergeant Michael Zuck and Sergeant Elton Conder, the latter a last-minute replacement from the 341st Squadron substituting for an irregular crew member, methodically checked and rechecked their .50 caliber Browning machine guns. In the tail position, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpolus, who would soon earn the nickname Lonesome Sam for reasons that would become horrifyingly apparent, settled into his isolated defensive station with the stoicism of someone who had fully accepted that he occupied the bomber's most vulnerable position. The 97th Bombardment Group held the distinction of being the first American heavy bomber unit to engage in combat operations in Europe, having flown their initial mission from English bases on August 17, 1942. Since then, the group had relocated to North African airfields as part of Operation Torch, supporting ground forces in their campaign to drive Axis forces from the African continent. The group had already paid a heavy price in aircraft and crews lost to enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and the unforgiving mathematics of strategic bombing operations. The day's designated target represented a critical component of the German supply system. The port facilities at Tunis and Bizerte served as vital entry points for supplies reaching Axis forces. Every ton of supplies that successfully reached these ports prolonged Axis resistance in North Africa. Conversely, every successful bombing run brought the Allies measurably closer to clearing the continent entirely and opening the pathway to invading southern Europe. The bomber formation assembled over the Mediterranean with the practiced precision of an aerial ballet that had been rehearsed countless times. 12 B-17s from the 414th Bombardment Squadron formed into their defensive box pattern, a three-dimensional arrangement specifically designed to maximize the overlapping fields of fire from their numerous .50 caliber machine guns. All-American 3 took her assigned position on the right wing of the lead aircraft, Flaming Mamie, which was commanded by Major Robert Coulter, the squadron operations officer. The absence of fighter escort cast a shadow over the entire formation. The P-38 Lightning fighters that should have been weaving protective patterns around the bombers were grounded due to mechanical problems. The B-17s would need to rely entirely on their own defensive armament and the theory of mutual protection through massed firepower, a doctrine that had yet to be thoroughly tested against determined and skillful fighter opposition. At 20,000 feet of altitude, the temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Ice formed rapidly on window surfaces, and the crew's breath froze inside their oxygen masks, requiring constant effort to break away the ice crystals that could potentially block vital airflow. The electrically heated flight suits, considered a marvel of American technological innovation, fought a perpetual losing battle against the Arctic conditions encountered at high altitude. Men frequently returned from missions suffering from frostbite injuries that rivaled their combat wounds in severity. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge's voice came through the intercom announcing that the target had come into sight as the city of Tunis materialized through scattered clouds below them. The port area bristled with activity. Ships were actively unloading supplies, trains waited on railway sidings, and trucks streamed continuously toward the front lines where Rommel's Africa Corps was making its final stand against Montgomery's Eighth Army, advancing from the east and American forces under Patton pushing from the west. The bomb run required absolutely unwavering precision. For 3 complete minutes, the aircraft had to maintain straight and level flight with no evasive maneuvers whatsoever, while Burbridge synchronized his Norden bomb sight with the target below. This secret device, which the Americans guarded so carefully that it was physically removed from every aircraft after each mission, employed a complex system of gyroscopes and mechanical calculations to determine the exact moment for releasing the bombs. Someone reported unnecessarily that anti-aircraft fire was coming up toward them. Everyone aboard could clearly see the black bursts blossoming around their formation, each puff representing hundreds of deadly shrapnel fragments seeking to find aluminum aircraft skin and human flesh. The German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, originally designed for anti-tank warfare, had proven devastatingly effective when deployed against bomber formations. Each shell was fused to detonate at a predetermined altitude, creating what amounted to a box of death that bombers had to fly directly through to reach their targets. Burbridge announced bombs away, and All-American 3 lurched suddenly upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosives fell away from her bomb bay. Below them, the port area erupted in smoke and flame. Direct hits on warehouse structures sparked secondary explosions from stored ammunition, and ships began listing at their moorings. It was an excellent strike, perhaps their most successful to date. The celebration proved short-lived. As the formation executed its turn westward toward home, the enemy fighters appeared. Multiple gunners simultaneously reported bandits approaching from 2 o'clock high position, identifying them as BF-109s. 2 Messerschmitt BF-109 G4 fighters dove from their concealed position in the sun's glare. The German pilots had learned through hard and costly experience that the B-17's defensive fire pattern was weakest from frontal approaches. The nose-mounted guns couldn't depress their angle of fire enough to effectively engage fighters attacking from low frontal positions, and the top turret couldn't traverse rapidly enough to track a high-speed frontal approach. The first fighter, piloted by Oberleutnant Julius Meinberg from the temporarily attached 11/JG2 unit of Jagdgeschwader 53, known as Picasse or Ace of Spades, opened fire at 500 yards distance. His 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns created sparkling flashes along his wings as he pumped rounds into the lead bomber, Flaming Mamie. The aircraft shuddered visibly under the impact, with pieces of aluminum peeling away like confetti in the slipstream. The second fighter, flown by Feldwebel Erich Passier from 6JG53, bore directly in on All-American 3. Passier was far from being a novice pilot. With 16 confirmed aerial victories to his credit, he had earned the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, the honor goblet awarded to successful fighter pilots by the German High Command. He understood exactly where to concentrate his fire: the cockpit area to eliminate the pilots, the engines to cripple the bomber's propulsion, and the wing routes where fuel tanks were located. Something went catastrophically wrong. At 300 yards distance, Pazia initiated his escape maneuver, executing a half-roll that should have taken him safely beneath the bomber and out of the concentrated defensive fire zone. This was a maneuver he had successfully performed dozens of times previously during his combat career. However, on this occasion, whether due to overconfidence, target fixation, mechanical failure, or another cause entirely, he began the maneuver too late in his attack run. Alternatively, and this is where the historical record becomes critically important for understanding what happened, he may not have initiated the maneuver at all because he was already dead or incapacitated. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge would later provide a clear recollection of events. He had the attacking fighter in his gun sights, approaching directly towards their position. He could actually see the pilot's face through the fighter's windscreen. Then the top turret opened fire. Technical Sergeant James had also acquired the target. The fighter suddenly jerked violently, as though yanked by an invisible string, and began executing a lazy, uncontrolled roll to the right. James, manning the twin .50 caliber machine guns in the top turret position, had placed a burst directly into the Bf-109's cockpit area. At least one round, possibly several, had struck Feldwebel Erich Pazia. Whether death was instantaneous, or he was merely rendered unconscious or incapacitated, the practical effect remained identical. 2,000 pounds of fighter aircraft travelling at over 350 miles per hour was suddenly operating without any conscious human control. What transpired next occurred in less than 2 seconds of elapsed time, yet the incident would be subjected to detailed analysis for decades to follow. The Bf-109, caught in its uncontrolled roll, sliced directly into All-American 3 just aft of the waist gun positions. The German fighter's left wing cut through the bomber's fuselage structure like a razor-sharp sword cutting through paper, creating a diagonal gash that ran from the base of the vertical stabilizer across to the left horizontal stabilizer, which was completely severed and torn away. Navigator Harry Newsell's contemporary account, written in a letter to his brother within days of the incident while details remained fresh in his memory, provides the most visceral and immediate description of what occurred. The fighter struck them with a swooshing sound and a bang that shook the entire aircraft structure. Looking back through the companionway passage, he couldn't believe what his eyes were showing him. He saw daylight streaming through where there should have been solid airplane structure. The physics of the impact seemed to defy all reasonable comprehension. The Bf-10-9's wing, travelling at a relative velocity approaching 400 miles per hour, should logically have cut the B-17 completely in half, resulting in immediate catastrophic structural failure. Instead, through what some would attribute to mere chance while many crew members would later insist was divine intervention, the fighter's wing missed the main structural load-bearing spars on the fuselage's right side by mere inches. The tail section, containing Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpolus in his isolated gun position, remained attached through what investigating engineers would later describe as the absolute minimum structural connection theoretically necessary to maintain any degree of control authority whatsoever. The German fighter disintegrated upon impact. Its wing, violently torn off by the collision forces, remained partially embedded in the B-17's fuselage structure. The engine assembly and forward fuselage section tumbled away in a ball of flame and smoke. The tail section, displaying its distinctive yellow nose cone and black cross national markings, spun downward like a maple seed falling from a tree, descending toward the desert below. Inside that burning wreckage was Feldwebel Erich Pazia, born May 7, 1918, who would receive a posthumous award of his Ehrenpokal on March 1, 1943, never knowing that his death had inadvertently created one of aviation history's most remarkable survival narratives. The crew of All-American 3 had no time available for contemplating the fate of their attacker. They confronted their own problems that, according to all established laws of physics and aerodynamics, should have been absolutely insurmountable and immediately fatal. Bragg's voice came through the intercom, steady and betraying none of the physical strain he was experiencing while wrestling with flight controls that had suddenly gone disturbingly mushy and unresponsive. He called for crew check-ins, asking if everyone was okay. The control cables leading to the tail control surfaces, specifically the elevator and rudder that allowed pilots to control the aircraft's pitch attitude and directional heading, had been either severed completely or severely damaged. The aircraft wanted to nose downward, to enter what pilots grimly referred to as a graveyard spiral from which there would be no recovery. One by one, crew members reported in over the intercom system. Miraculously, incredibly, no one had sustained any injuries in the collision itself. However, when the tail gunner's turn came to report his status, the intercom remained silent and unresponsive. Bragg called for Sarpalus repeatedly. "Sam," he called, asking if he was okay back there. Still nothing came through the intercom system. The interphone communication line to the tail position had been cut during the collision. Through the jagged hole torn in the fuselage, the waist gunners could observe movement in the tail section. Sam Sarpalus was alive back there, but he was trapped in a tail section that was moving independently from the rest of the aircraft structure, swaying with each air current and atmospheric disturbance like, as one crew member would describe it, a kite attached to a string during a hurricane. The full extent of the catastrophic damage was absolutely staggering when assessed in its entirety. The left horizontal stabilizer was completely gone, shorn away by the Bf-109's wing during the collision. The elevator control surface on that side had vanished along with it. The vertical stabilizer, that large upright tail surface, displayed a massive gash running through its base structure. The fuselage itself had been opened like a tin can being cut open from the tail gunner's position forward to just behind the waist gun window positions. Control cables hung loose and useless in the airstream. Hydraulic fluid leaked steadily from severed lines, draining vital systems. Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth, serving as navigator aboard the nearby B-17 nicknamed Flying Flit Gun, managed to maneuver his aircraft close enough to take a photograph that would subsequently become one of the war's most famous and widely reproduced images. In this photograph, the tail section of All-American 3 is clearly visible as being offset from its normal alignment, canted at an angle that strongly suggests imminent complete structural failure. The diagonal slash running through the fuselage is readily apparent, along with the completely missing stabilizer. The fact that the aircraft appears to be maintaining level flight seems to violate fundamental and well-established laws of physics. Someone breathed an expletive over the intercom system. The entire back end of the aircraft appeared ready to separate completely at any moment. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. worked frantically alongside Bragg, searching desperately for some combination of control inputs that would maintain them in the air. With the traditional control surfaces severely compromised, innovation became absolutely necessary for survival. The autopilot system, which connected to the Norden bomb site and used electrical servos rather than mechanical cable connections, could be partially engaged to provide some measure of stability. Differential engine power, running the left engines at higher settings than the right engines, could help counteract the aircraft's tendency to yaw off course. Every control input had to be gentle and carefully measured. Too much force applied to any control surface, and the tail section might simply tear away completely. Major Coulter's voice crackled through the radio from Flaming Mamie, which had also suffered serious damage during the fighter attack. He asked if All-American could make it home. Bragg looked at the fuel quantity gauges displayed before him. No major fuel leaks were apparent, and tanks still showed adequate reserves remaining. All 4 engines continued running, with temperatures and pressures remaining within normal operating parameters. Electrical systems continued functioning properly. The only significant problem with the aircraft was that a substantial portion of its structural integrity had been destroyed. A relatively minor detail, all things considered. Bragg responded that they were going to attempt the return flight. In the nearly severed tail section, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpalus faced a decision that would have completely paralyzed most individuals. He could remain where he was, hoping desperately that the tail structure would hold together until landing, or he could attempt crawling forward through the severely damaged fuselage to reach the relative safety of the main aircraft body. The tail section was moving independently, sometimes displaced by several feet out of proper alignment with the rest of the aircraft. Each movement stressed the few remaining structural connections that much more. Any sudden aircraft maneuver, any encounter with strong atmospheric turbulence, and he would be riding 5 tons of aluminum structure to his death. Sarpalus reached his decision. Gathering his chest-mounted parachute, his equipment, and notably, in a detail that would become part of the legend, a borrowed jacket that belonged to Lieutenant Bragg, he began what would be the most dangerous 30 feet of distance he would ever travel in his entire life. The scene inside the damaged fuselage was nothing short of apocalyptic. Daylight streamed through numerous tears in the aluminum skin. Wind howled through the gaps with tremendous force, creating a complete maelstrom of loose equipment, spent shell casings, and debris fragments from the destroyed German fighter. The fuselage floor structure, never designed to support weight without the surrounding frame and skin providing structural support, flexed dangerously under his hands and knees as he crawled. One wrong move, one failure of the overstressed aluminum structure, and he would fall through into 5 miles of empty air between himself and the desert surface. Waist gunner Michael Zuck watched Sarpalus's approach with a combination of profound admiration and complete disbelief. He would later recall that Sarpalus came crawling through that catastrophic mess as though he were taking a casual Sunday stroll, maintaining remarkable calm and composure while dragging his equipment behind him. When Sarpalus finally reached the forward section, the first action he took was handing Lieutenant Bragg's borrowed jacket to Zuck with instructions to ensure the skipper received it back, noting that he might need it when they landed. The journey that should have required mere seconds had consumed nearly 10 full minutes, but Sam Sarpalus had successfully completed it. All 10 crew members were now located in the forward section of the aircraft, should emergency bailout become necessary. The bomber formation confronted a terrible decision that tested the bonds of unit cohesion. Standard operational procedure absolutely dictated that damaged aircraft unable to maintain formation speed should be abandoned to their fate. Such aircraft endangered the entire formation by forcing reduced speed and extended time in enemy airspace, creating increased vulnerability to fighter attack. However, the crews of the 414th Squadron refused to abandon All-American 3 to her fate. The formation closed protective ranks around the wounded bomber, creating a defensive shield through their massed firepower concentration. This decision meant accepting substantially greater risk for themselves, flying slower than optimal, maintaining tight formation for extended periods, and remaining in hostile airspace for precious additional minutes beyond what was strictly necessary. These were men who had trained together, endured the harsh conditions of North African air bases together, and lost friends together in combat. The cold arithmetic of survival calculations took second place to unit loyalty and brotherhood. The formation commander radioed All-American, identifying himself as Red Leader, announcing that they would maintain escort until the damaged bomber cleared enemy fighter operational range. He instructed them to keep the aircraft steady. The German fighters, observing the tight defensive formation and likely running low on both fuel and ammunition, eventually broke off their attacks and turned away toward their own bases. They had claimed their victories for the day, or so they believed. Julius Meinberg, who had been Erich Patzier's wingman during the attack, would survive the engagement despite suffering severe burn injuries when defensive fire ignited his aircraft's oxygen system. In his post-war memoir titled Feindberührung, or Contact with the Enemy, He would claim credit for a B-17 destruction from this particular engagement. His claim was partially accurate. Flaming Mamie would indeed go down, with Major Coulter and 6 of his crew members killed in the crash. But All-American 3 adamantly refused to die despite all physical laws suggesting she should. As the formation finally crossed into Allied-controlled airspace, the other bombers began peeling away from the formation, waggling their wings in salute as they set course for Biskra. All-American 3, forced to fly at significantly reduced airspeed to minimize stress on her damaged structure, would make the remaining journey alone without escort or formation support. The flight from the target area back to Biskra airfield should have required approximately 1 hour under normal circumstances. For All-American 3, fighting desperately to remain airborne minute by minute, the journey would consume 90 minutes that subjectively felt like 90 complete years. Every air pocket encountered, every bit of atmospheric turbulence, sent shudders through the aircraft structure that made every crew member hold their breath in apprehension. The tail section continued its independent movement, sometimes achieving alignment with the fuselage, sometimes canted at angles that seemed to defy rational belief. Bragg and Engel developed a careful rhythm between them, executing a delicate dance with their dying aircraft. They applied gentle pressure on the control yoke, scrupulously avoiding any sudden movements. They adjusted engine throttles in tiny increments, sensing the aircraft's response through their hands and feet, then making additional small adjustments. They flew more through developed instinct than by reference to their instruments, sensing through tactile feedback what the aircraft structure could tolerate and what might cause catastrophic failure. Flight engineer Joe James monitored the engines with obsessive attention to detail. Engine number 3 was running slightly hotter than normal, possibly due to debris damage, but temperature remained within acceptable operating limits. Oil pressure held steady across all 4 power plants. Fuel consumption had actually improved somewhat due to their reduced airspeed. The Wright Cyclone radial engines, manufactured in factories across America by workers who would never know how their precision craftsmanship saved lives this day, continued their steady, reliable thunder. Bragg asked his navigator for distance remaining to base. Harry Newsell had been continuously calculating and recalculating their position throughout the return flight. The structural damage had affected the aircraft's trim characteristics, causing it to fly slightly sideways in what pilots called a crab angle. This affected both their ground speed and fuel consumption calculations, but his figures showed they would reach base, albeit with minimal fuel reserves remaining. He reported 40 minutes to destination, adding that weather remained clear at their home field. Radio operator Paul Galloway had maintained constant contact with Biskra Tower throughout their return flight, providing regular updates on the aircraft's condition and status. The airbase had mobilized every available emergency vehicle in response. Ambulances, fire trucks, and crash recovery crews lined the runway approaches. The base commanding officer himself had come personally to the control tower to monitor the situation as it developed. The crew methodically went through their landing preparation procedures with mechanical precision, each man checking and rechecking his equipment and station. They kept their parachutes on and readily accessible. If the tail section separated during the landing sequence, they might have only seconds available to evacuate the aircraft before catastrophic failure. Waist gunners Zuck and Conda cleared all loose equipment that could potentially become lethal projectiles during a crash landing. Bombardier Burbridge secured the Norden bomb site, ensuring this valuable secret device wouldn't be damaged or lost. Bragg understood his aircraft's capabilities and limitations intimately after months of flying her. German technical intelligence analysis had determined through extensive combat experience that a B-17 bomber typically required approximately 20 direct hits from 20mm cannon shells to ensure complete destruction. The aircraft's multiple redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and exceptionally robust construction made it frustratingly difficult to bring down with certainty. However, this situation, a B-17 flying with approximately half its tail structure missing, was beyond any German calculations or doctrine. Initial intelligence reports reaching Luftwaffe headquarters were met with considerable skepticism. Surely the American pilots had been mistaken about the extent of damage. Perhaps the bomber had crashed later, out of sight of German observers. No aircraft could possibly survive such catastrophic structural damage and continue flying. Yet the evidence proved absolutely incontrovertible. Multiple German pilots had personally witnessed All-American 3 maintaining formation flight long after the collision occurred. Ground-based radar operators had tracked the aircraft on their scopes, showing it maintaining altitude and steady heading long after it should logically have fallen from the sky. The incident would be incorporated into a growing file of troubling reports that forced the Luftwaffe to fundamentally reconsider their tactical doctrine for attacking American heavy bomber formations. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most successful fighter aces and a key figure in developing Luftwaffe fighter tactics throughout the war, would later write extensively about the psychological impact that American bomber durability had on German fighter pilots. To observe a flying fortress continuing to fly with injuries that would have instantly destroyed any other known aircraft type was deeply demoralizing to young German pilots, he noted. They would expend their entire ammunition load, score what should clearly have been killing hits based on all training and experience, and then watch helplessly as the American bombers simply flew home to their bases. Bragg's voice came over the radio to Biskra Tower, announcing they were 5 minutes from the field and requesting a straight-in approach to runway 27. The tower controller immediately cleared All-American for immediate approach to runway 27, confirming that emergency vehicles were standing by and ready. He inquired about casualties aboard the aircraft. Bragg and Engel exchanged significant glances between them. By all reasonable expectations and physical laws, they should all be dead already. Yet here they were, 10 men without a single scratch among them, at least not from the actual mid-air collision itself. Bragg responded to the tower that they had no wounded personnel. They simply needed a straight-in approach due to structural damage. The understatement of the entire year, quite possibly. Through the cockpit windscreen, the brown expanse of Biskra airfield materialized from the desert heat haze. Home, safety, solid ground. It was quite simply the most beautiful sight any of them had ever witnessed in their lives. Engel announced he was lowering the landing gear, moving the control lever to the down position. The landing gear operated on a separate hydraulic system from the flight control surfaces, and to everyone's profound relief, they heard and felt the reassuring mechanical thunk of wheels locking into their extended position. 3 green indicator lights illuminated on the instrument panel, confirming the gear was properly down and locked. Engel asked about deploying flaps for landing. Bragg considered the question carefully. Wing flaps would reduce their landing speed significantly, which would normally be highly desirable. However, flaps would also substantially change the airflow pattern over the tail structure, potentially adding critical stress to the already severely damaged components. He made his decision. No flaps would be deployed. They would come in faster than normal and use the entire available runway length for deceleration. The approach required every ounce of piloting skill that Bragg had developed through hundreds of hours of intensive flight training. The aircraft simply didn't want to fly straight and true. It wanted to yaw sideways, to roll unexpectedly, to pitch nose down. Every corrective input required an immediate opposite correction to counteract secondary effects. It was a constant, exhausting battle against aerodynamic forces that by all rights should have won this contest 80 miles ago. At 1 mile distance from the runway, then half a mile. The runway rushed up to meet them, appearing wider and more welcoming than any runway surface had ever appeared before. Ground crew personnel lined the taxiways, watching in stunned silence as this impossible aircraft made its final approach. Some observers would later state they could see daylight streaming completely through the fuselage from a quarter-mile away. The main landing gear wheels kissed the sand-swept runway surface at 110 miles per hour, considerably faster than normal landing speed, but as gently as Bragg could possibly manage under the circumstances. The aircraft settled onto its main gear, and for one brief moment it seemed the landing would be textbook perfect despite everything. Then fundamental physics reasserted itself with a vengeance. Without a functional tail wheel, which had been completely destroyed during the collision, the tail section dropped heavily to the runway surface. The aircraft essentially became a 65,000-pound sled, grinding down the runway in a spectacular shower of sparks and aluminum fragments. The sound produced was utterly indescribable, metal scraping against concrete, creating a shriek that could be heard for miles in every direction. Bragg and Engel stood hard on the wheel brakes, fighting desperately to keep the aircraft tracking straight ahead as it decelerated. Without the tail wheel for directional control and with severely compromised rudder authority, any deviation from straight ahead could precipitate a violent ground loop, a spinning rotation that would certainly tear the weakened aircraft structure completely apart. 100 yards of runway consumed, then 200, then 300. The aircraft finally ground to a complete stop, sitting at an awkward and unnatural angle with its tail resting on the runway pavement and its nose pointed upward toward the sky. For a long moment, absolutely nobody moved. Then, as if responding to some unspoken signal, all 10 crew members scrambled frantically for the exits, evacuating the aircraft as rapidly as possible. They assembled on the hot runway surface, turning to look back at their aircraft with expressions of complete disbelief. The damage appeared even worse than they had imagined during flight. The tail section hung at an impossible angle, connected to the fuselage by what appeared to be mere strips of aluminum no thicker than heavy paper. How these strips had held together for 90 continuous minutes of flight transcended all comprehension. Bragg informed the flight surgeon, who had rushed up with his complete medical team in tow, that nobody required medical attention. They were all fine, without a single scratch among them. The doctor looked from the assembled crew to the catastrophically damaged aircraft and back again, his expression clearly suggesting he was witnessing either a genuine miracle or experiencing some form of mass hallucination. What transpired next would become an integral part of the legend, told and retold in ready rooms across the entire theatre of operations. 3 ground crew members from another squadron, curious about examining the extraordinary damage they'd heard about, climbed aboard All-American 3 to get a closer look at the destruction. They made their way carefully aft through the fuselage, peering through the massive gash, marvelling at the extent of destruction. Their combined weight, perhaps 500 pounds total, proved to be the final straw for the overstressed structure. With a grinding, tearing sound of metal that had finally reached the absolute limit of its endurance, the tail section separated completely from the main fuselage and collapsed heavily onto the runway surface. The 3 airmen scrambled clear, white-faced and physically shaking, suddenly understanding with absolute clarity just how close to certain death the flight crew had been for the past 90 minutes of flight. Master Sergeant Hank Hyland, the crew chief with primary responsibility for maintaining All-American 3, walked slowly around the wreckage, taking detailed notes on his clipboard. His assignment would be determining whether the aircraft could feasibly be repaired and returned to operational status, or should be officially written off as a total loss and scrapped for spare parts. It was a question that should have been purely academic and obvious. No aircraft this catastrophically damaged could ever possibly fly again under any circumstances. However, this was 1943, and America was producing B-17 flying fortresses at a rate that seemed absolutely impossible to everyone except the Americans themselves. In Seattle, Burbank and Long Beach, California, factory workers were completing brand new flying fortresses at a pace of 1 aircraft every few hours. The production lines operated continuously, 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly, staffed by men either too old or too young for military service, and increasingly by women who had never seen the inside of any factory before the Pearl Harbor attack galvanized the nation. Hyland examined the serial number painted on the damaged tail section, 41-24406. This particular aircraft had already survived far more punishment and stress than any machine should reasonably be asked to endure. Perhaps, just perhaps, she had one final miracle remaining in her. Conventional wisdom and standard practice clearly indicated that All-American 3 was finished as an operational aircraft. The damage was far too extensive, the structural integrity too severely compromised. In any other air force operating anywhere in the world, the aircraft would have been immediately cannibalized for usable spare parts, with the remainder scrapped for raw materials. However, the United States Army Air Forces in 1943 operated according to a fundamentally different philosophy. If something could possibly be repaired, then it would be repaired and returned to service. Master Sergeant Hyland and his men from the 50th Air Service Squadron invested 6 complete weeks performing what could only accurately be described as major surgical reconstruction. They located a tail section salvaged from another B-17 that had been damaged beyond economical repair in a landing accident. Using techniques and procedures more commonly suited to a naval shipyard than an aircraft maintenance facility, they carefully grafted the salvaged tail section onto All-American 3's damaged fuselage. The work required was meticulous and physically exhausting. Every single rivet had to be absolutely perfect. Every control cable had to be properly tensioned to exact specifications. Every electrical connection had to be tested and retested repeatedly until flawless operation was confirmed. The maintenance crews worked in desert heat that regularly reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit during daylight hours, then through the desert nights when temperatures would plummet dramatically toward freezing. They worked with dedication and precision because they understood that every repaired aircraft represented one additional bomber available to strike at the enemy, one measurable step closer to ending this war and bringing everyone home. The repair work could never meet original Boeing factory standards and specifications. The aircraft would never be quite the same as she had been. She would be slightly slower, somewhat less responsive to control inputs and prone to vibrations that hadn't existed before the damage. But on May 10, 1943, All-American 3 flew again, carrying a different crew on a bombing mission targeting Sicily. The ground crews who had worked so hard to resurrect her watched her take off with a complex mixture of pride in their craftsmanship and apprehension about whether their repairs would hold together under operational stress. She did hold together. All-American 3 would continue flying combat missions, though she was wisely relegated to less demanding operational roles. Transport flights, training missions, and what crews called milk runs to target areas where enemy fighter opposition was unlikely became her assignments. She had earned the right to a somewhat easier operational life after her ordeal. On March 6, 1945, at Lucera Airfield in Italy, she was finally retired from service and salvaged for usable materials. Her war was over at last after years of faithful service. Research into the identity of the German pilot who collided with All-American 3 reveals a young man whose personal story intersected with history in the most violent manner imaginable. Feldwebel Erich Patzier was 24 years old on February 1, 1943, making him only 1 year younger than Kendrick Bragg. Born on May 7, 1918, Patzier had grown up in a Germany fundamentally transformed by National Socialism, trained in civilian glider clubs that were secretly preparing pilots for a Luftwaffe that wasn't officially supposed to exist under the Treaty of Versailles restrictions. By early 1943, Patzier had proven himself an exceptional fighter pilot through combat performance. His 16 confirmed aerial victories placed him solidly among the successful, though not legendary, aces of the Luftwaffe. He was one of those men who performed their duties with considerable skill and consistent professionalism, but whose names wouldn't be celebrated in widespread propaganda broadcasts or immortalized in popular culture. He flew with 6/JG-53 Pickaz, or Ace of Spades, one of the most successful fighter wings in the entire Luftwaffe, collectively credited with over 4,000 Allied aircraft destroyed throughout the war. The Bf-109 G4 fighter he flew that particular day represented the latest evolutionary development of Willy Messerschmitt's revolutionary fighter design. Powered by a Daimler-Benz DB605 engine producing 1,475 horsepower, armed with a 20mm cannon, firing directly through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns mounted in the nose cowling, it was an absolutely formidable opponent for any Allied aircraft that encountered it. In the hands of an experienced and skilled pilot like Erich Pazier, it should theoretically have been more than adequate match for any lumbering B-17 bomber formation. However, the calculus governing aerial combat is utterly unforgiving of any mistakes. One single moment of inattention, one bullet striking in precisely the wrong place, and years of accumulated experience become completely irrelevant in an instant. The burst of .50 caliber fire from Technical Sergeant Joe James's twin machine guns in the top turret found its target with lethal accuracy, and Erich Pazier's war ended instantly in the skies over Tunisia. His body was subsequently recovered from the wreckage of his crashed fighter and buried at Borj Sedria German War Cemetery in Ben Arous, Tunisia, where it remains to this day in Plot 3, Row 8, Grave 15. On March 1, 1943, Pazier received a posthumous award of the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, that honour goblet specifically recognising his achievements and service as a fighter pilot. The official citation made absolutely no mention of the mid-air collision, merely noting formally that he had died in aerial combat operations against enemy bomber formations. His family received the traditional formal letter from his commanding officer expressing official regret and praising his dedicated service to the Reich. They would never know that their son's death had inadvertently created one of the most remarkable and extensively studied survival stories in the entire history of aviation. The survival of All-American 3 rapidly became an intensive case study for Boeing engineers and Army Air Force's technical analysts seeking to understand the incident. How had an aircraft missing absolutely critical structural components managed to remain airborne and controllable for 90 continuous minutes? The answer lay fundamentally in the revolutionary design philosophy that had created the B-17 in the first place. Unlike previous bomber designs, which relied primarily on a single main structural spar running through the wing and fuselage to carry loads, the B-17 employed what engineers called semi-monocoque construction. The aircraft's strength came not from any single component or structural member, but rather from the entire structure working together as an integrated system. The aluminum skin itself carried significant loads, reinforced throughout by frames and stringers that distributed stress forces throughout the entire airframe structure. When primary load-bearing paths failed catastrophically, secondary and even tertiary backup paths could, under precisely the right circumstances and conditions, carry sufficient load to maintain basic structural integrity and prevent immediate catastrophic failure. The critical key to All-American 3's survival was understanding what structural elements hadn't been damaged during the collision. The wing-to-fuselage junction, representing the single strongest structural point on the entire aircraft, remained completely intact and undamaged. The main wing spars, carrying the substantial weight of 4 engines and all fuel tanks, were undamaged. The bomb bay area, with its exceptionally robust construction made necessary by the requirement to carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance, provided a rigid structural box that held the forward and aft fuselage sections together even when the normal connecting structure between them was severely compromised. Boeing engineer William Allen, reviewing the extensive incident reports and technical analysis, noted that the B-17 had been specifically designed from its initial conception with combat damage survivability in mind. They knew absolutely that these aircraft would inevitably take hits during combat operations, he wrote in a technical memorandum circulated within the company. They had built in structural redundancy wherever physically possible. Multiple control cable runs provided backup capability. Backup hydraulic systems ensured continued operation. Structural members were designed to carry loads even when neighbouring members failed completely. The fact that this particular aircraft survived such extreme damage validates every extra pound of structure they had included in the design, even when accountants and efficiency experts had questioned the necessity. The electrical system architecture played an absolutely crucial role in the aircraft's survival that day. While mechanical control cables were severed or severely damaged, the electrical wiring running to the autopilot servo motors remained at least partially functional throughout the ordeal. This allowed Bragg and Engel to maintain some degree of control authority through the Norden bomb site's autopilot system, employing a capability that hadn't been specifically designed for this emergency purpose but proved absolutely invaluable under these extreme circumstances. The survival of All-American 3 sent significant ripples throughout both Allied and Axis air forces, affecting operations and morale in multiple ways. For American bomber crews throughout the theater, the incident rapidly became a morale-boosting legend, told and retold in briefing rooms from England to Italy and North Africa. If All-American could make it home with half her tail literally shot off, then surely their own damaged aircraft could successfully make the return journey as well. The psychological impact of this belief proved immeasurable and significantly valuable. Crews flew subsequent missions with markedly greater confidence, knowing from documented proof that their flying fortresses could absorb punishment levels that would instantly destroy other aircraft types. The 414th Bombardment Squadron formally adopted a new unit emblem directly inspired by the All-American 3 incident. The emblem depicted a small dog praying while positioned atop an aircraft's tail section, a direct reference to the popular phrase and song, "Coming in on a wing and a prayer." Although that famous song had actually been written about a different aircraft called Thunderbird, the association with All-American 3 became permanently embedded in squadron lore and identity. For the Germans, this incident significantly reinforced growing concerns about American industrial capability that were increasingly troubling Luftwaffe leadership. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, who bore primary responsibility for Luftwaffe aircraft production programs, had already issued stark warnings about the strategic implications of American bomber production capacity. "The Americans are building bombers faster than we build automobiles," he told a conference of fighter commanders with obvious concern. "And these bombers are absolutely not fragile machines. They are flying tanks that can absorb incredible punishment." The tactical implications of All-American 3's survival were substantial and immediate. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine had assumed based on combat experience that catastrophic structural damage would reliably destroy any bomber. Fighter pilots received training to aim for specific critical points, wing routes, cockpit areas, bomb bays, where a few well-placed cannon shells should theoretically prove immediately fatal. Incidents like All-American 3 provided troubling proof that even seemingly perfect shots delivering what should have been killing blows might not actually bring down a B-17 bomber. Major Günther Roll, who would eventually become the third highest-scoring fighter ace in history with 275 confirmed victories, wrote extensively about the psychological frustration of repeatedly attacking B-17 formations. "You would make your attack run, score visible hits, observe pieces flying off the target aircraft, and then watch in disbelief as the bomber simply continued flying straight and level," he recalled. "You would attack again, expending your entire ammunition supply, scoring additional hits, and still the bomber would fly onward out of range." It was deeply frustrating and demoralizing for young pilots. The Germans began developing entirely new tactical approaches in response. They emphasized attacking from frontal aspects, where defensive armament coverage was demonstrably weakest. They began concentrating multiple fighters simultaneously on single-target bombers rather than spreading attacks across the formation. They developed progressively heavier weapons specifically optimized for bomber destruction. The 30mm Mk-108 cannon, firing explosive shells capable of blowing meter-wide holes in bomber structures, was a direct response to the B-17's frustrating durability and ability to absorb damage. The 10 men who survived the impossible flight of All-American 3 would carry that experience with them for the remainder of their lives, each processing and dealing with it in his own individual way. Their story, thoroughly verified by extensive contemporary documentation and numerous eyewitness accounts, stands as one of the most comprehensively documented incidents in World War II aviation history. First Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson Bragg Jr. would successfully complete his full combat tour of duty and return to the United States, where he subsequently served as a flight instructor, teaching new bomber crews the skills and techniques that might someday save their lives in combat. He rarely spoke about the events of February 1st, 1943, even to his own family members. When pressed for details, he would simply state they were lucky, that it was a good airplane with a good crew, and they got lucky. He passed away on October 13, 1999, at the age of 81, taking with him the complete measure of what it truly felt like to fly an aircraft that, according to all engineering principles, shouldn't have been flyable at all. Navigator Harry C. Newsell's letter, written to his family within days of the incident, preserved complete with all 10 crew members' signatures, provides historians with the most contemporary and immediate first-hand account of the event available. The letter captures the immediate aftermath before time, and repeated retelling could alter or distort details. He wrote that he still couldn't believe they had actually made it back. When he looked back through the aircraft and saw daylight streaming through where solid airplane structure should have been, he was absolutely certain they were finished. But somehow Bragg and Engel had kept her flying. He honestly didn't know how they'd managed it. Some historical sources have incorrectly stated that the collision occurred during their outbound flight to the target. Burbridge spent considerable effort in his later years correcting this particular error whenever he encountered it. The collision definitively happened on their return journey home, not during the inbound flight. They also weren't headed toward England, as some accounts mistakenly claim, but rather returning to their operational base in Algeria. Burbridge understood clearly that the true story was remarkable enough without requiring any embellishment or exaggeration. He passed away on February 3, 2013, at age 92, one of the last surviving eyewitnesses to that extraordinary day over Tunisia. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. returned to his home in Connecticut after the war concluded, rarely if ever speaking about his military service experiences. People who knew him well reported that he would sometimes unconsciously move his hands as though working aircraft flight controls, particularly during thunderstorms. He lived until May 3, 2007, dying at age 92 with his family gathered around him. Technical Sergeant Joe C. James, whose accurate gunnery had killed Eric Pazier and directly precipitated the collision that nearly killed them all, struggled throughout his life with the complex moral paradox of his role in the event. He had saved his crew by successfully shooting down an attacking enemy fighter, exactly as trained and exactly as his duty required. But that action had led directly to a mid-air collision that had nearly killed every man aboard. The paradox haunted him. When asked about it, he would state simply that he had done his job, nothing more and nothing less. That's all any of them had done, just their assigned jobs. The waist gunners, Michael Zuck and Elton Conda, maintained consistently throughout their lives that watching Sam Sarpolus crawl forward through the destroyed fuselage section was the single bravest action they personally witnessed during the entire war. They saw many brave men perform many brave actions during their combat service, Zuck stated in a 1985 interview, but Sam Sarpolus crawling through that catastrophic mess, maintaining perfect calm throughout, that was something genuinely special and extraordinary. Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpolus himself, Lonesome Sam, who had ridden the severed tail section and then crawled to safety, became something of a living legend throughout the Army Air Forces. His matter-of-fact courage, exemplified perfectly by his concern for properly returning Bragg's borrowed jacket, represented precisely the kind of unflappable determination that characterized the very best American aircrew members. When asked directly about his crawl forward through the damaged fuselage, his response was characteristically pragmatic. What else was he supposed to do? Just sit there passively and wait to fall out of the sky. It was far better to die trying to reach safety than to die waiting passively for the inevitable. Radio operator Paul Galloway noted in subsequent interviews that maintaining continuous communication with their home base during the return flight was one of the hardest things he ever did in his life. Every time the aircraft lurched or shuddered, he thought they were coming apart completely. But he kept transmitting their position updates, keeping his voice steady and professional throughout. If they did go down, he wanted base operations to know exactly where to search for them. The famous photograph taken by Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth from Flying Flit Gun became one of World War II's most extensively analysed images. Officially catalogued as US Air Force Photo 050524-F-123-4-P-015, it shows All-American 3 in clear profile against the North African desert background. The catastrophic damage to her tail section is clearly and unmistakably visible in the photograph. The image would be intensively studied by engineers, pilots, and military historians for decades following the war, each searching for additional clues to explain the seemingly impossible survival. What the photograph reveals is simultaneously devastating damage and improbable survival existing together. The left horizontal stabilizer is completely absent, torn away entirely. The vertical stabilizer displays a massive diagonal gash running through its structure. The fuselage is opened dramatically from the tail gunner's position forward through the waist section. Yet despite all this catastrophic damage, the aircraft clearly maintains level flight. All 4 engines are visibly running normally. There's no indication whatsoever of the imminent structural failure that physics and engineering principles demand should be occurring at any moment. The photograph has been frequently misattributed and misidentified over the subsequent decades. It has been published with captions incorrectly claiming it shows the aircraft flying over the English Channel, escorted by P-51 Mustang fighters that didn't even exist in the theatre at that time. Some published versions have been digitally manipulated to make the damage appear even more dramatic than it actually was. But the original authenticated photograph requires absolutely no embellishment or exaggeration. It captures a moment that simply shouldn't exist according to known physics. An aircraft flying in apparent defiance of damage that exceeds all established design tolerances, all safety margins, all reasonable expectations. It stands as visual proof of what 10 determined men achieved through skill, determination, and what many would insist was divine intervention. The incident of February 1st, 1943, occurred at an absolutely crucial juncture in the broader North African campaign. Rommel's Afrika Korps, once seemingly invincible under his brilliant tactical leadership, was being systematically squeezed between Montgomery's 8th Army advancing relentlessly from the east and American forces pushing aggressively from the western approaches. The port facilities at Tunis and Bizerte, which had been that day's bombing targets, represented vital lifeline connections for Axis forces still resisting in Africa. Every successful bombing mission against these facilities measurably hastened the inevitable German and Italian surrender in the theatre. Within 3 months of All-American 3's miraculous return to base, Axis military forces in North Africa would capitulate entirely. On May 13, 1943, nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia, representing a defeat fully comparable to Stalingrad in its devastating impact on overall German military capability and strategic position. The bombers of the 97th Bombardment Group, including the remarkably repaired All-American 3, had played their significant part in achieving this crucial victory. The B-17 Flying Fortress would go on to become the single most iconic American bomber of World War II, despite the fact that the B-24 Liberator was actually produced in substantially greater numbers and could carry heavier bomb loads over longer distances. It was specifically the B-17 that captured public imagination and became symbolic of American air power. Its demonstrated ability to absorb tremendous punishment and still bring its crews home safely became legendary throughout the service. By war's end, B-17 bombers had dropped 640,036 tons of bombs on European targets, more than any other American aircraft type employed in the conflict. However, the human cost of these operations was absolutely staggering and must never be forgotten. Of the 12,731 B-17 flying fortresses produced during the war, 4,735 were lost in combat operations. Each loss represented 10 young men who would never return home to their families. The survival rate for bomber crew members was among the lowest of any military occupation during the war. Successfully completing a 25-mission combat tour, later raised to 35 missions, was considered beating very long odds indeed. The miracle of All-American III's survival stood in stark, dramatic contrast to the brutal arithmetic of strategic bombing warfare. The incident demonstrated that survival was possible under seemingly impossible circumstances, but it could never erase the reality that thousands of other bomber crews weren't as fortunate, weren't as skilled, or simply weren't as lucky when they encountered catastrophic damage. The B-17's design philosophy included multiple redundant load paths for all critical force-bearing structures. When primary structural members failed completely, secondary backup systems, never originally intended to carry full operational loads, somehow managed to hold together just enough to maintain basic structural integrity. Speed reduction played a crucial role. By immediately reducing airspeed following the collision, Bragg minimized the aerodynamic forces actively trying to tear the aircraft apart. Every mile per hour of speed reduction decreased structural stress exponentially. Detailed post-incident analysis clearly shows that any aggressive or abrupt control input would have instantly exceeded the remaining structure's capability to withstand forces. Bragg and Engel's extremely gentle, carefully coordinated control movements kept all forces within barely survivable limits. Weight distribution changes actually helped their survival in an unexpected way. The crew movement forward from the isolated tail section helped by shifting the aircraft's center of gravity forward, partially compensating for the lost tail weight. Environmental factors proved critically important. The relatively smooth air conditions over the North African desert meant they encountered no severe turbulence to stress the damaged structure further. Had they encountered a thunderstorm or any severe turbulence, the aircraft absolutely would not have survived. The engineering community continues actively studying this incident decades later, as a prime example of how robust, redundant design combined with exceptionally skilled piloting can achieve seemingly impossible outcomes. The lessons learned from analyzing All-American III's survival directly influenced post-war military aircraft design philosophy, particularly in the critical areas of structural redundancy and battle damage tolerance capabilities. Extensive research into Luftwaffe operational archives provides valuable German perspective on this incident. The loss of Feldwebel Erich Patzier was formally recorded in the official war diary of JG 53, with characteristic German precision and attention to detail. The entry states simply that Feldwebel Patzier failed to return from a combat mission against an American bomber formation, that he was witnessed colliding with an enemy aircraft by Oberleutnant Meinberg, and that both aircraft and pilot were lost. These cold, factual official records naturally don't capture the actual impact such incidents had on overall German fighter pilot morale. Young German pilots, many possessing less than 100 total hours of flight time by 1943 due to increasingly abbreviated training programs, were told repeatedly that American bombers were relatively easy targets, slow, vulnerable, and readily destroyed with proper tactics. Then these young pilots would attack these supposedly easy targets in actual combat and watch in frustrated disbelief as the bombers absorbed incredible amounts of damage and simply kept flying onward. Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, who developed the innovative head-on attack tactic that would eventually become standard Luftwaffe doctrine against heavy bomber formations, wrote candidly that American bombers were absolutely not what German forces had expected to encounter. They had expected bombers similar to German designs, relatively fragile, requiring constant fighter escort protection, highly vulnerable to determined and aggressive attack. Instead, they discovered flying fortresses in the truest sense of that name, genuine castles flying through the air that could effectively defend themselves and survive damage that seemed physically impossible. The Luftwaffe began maintaining increasingly detailed records of B-17 survivability, desperately trying to determine structural weak points and optimal attack angles. Their extensive studies consistently showed that even when German fighters achieved what should clearly be catastrophic damage based on all previous experience, B-17 bombers displayed a disturbing tendency to make it back to their bases anyway. This frustrating reality led directly to development of increasingly heavy armament specifically for fighter aircraft, culminating in air-to-air rockets and 30mm cannons specifically designed for reliable bomber destruction. At the massive Boeing manufacturing plant in Seattle, news of All-American 3's survival was received with quiet satisfaction and professional pride. The engineers and production workers who had originally designed and constructed aircraft 41-24406 had never personally met any of the men who flew her in combat, but they felt a genuine connection nonetheless. Every rivet they had driven, every wire they had carefully connected, every system they had painstakingly tested had contributed directly to bringing those 10 men safely home from what should have been certain death. The B-17 design program had originally begun in 1934 when the U.S. Army Air Corps issued formal requirements for a new multi-engine bomber. Boeing's Model 299, which would evolve into the production B-17, first flew on July 28, 1935. From the absolute beginning, the underlying design philosophy emphasized survivability above many other considerations. Multiple engines ensured the aircraft could continue flying even with 1 or 2 power plants failed. Redundant control systems provided backup capability. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires. Armor plating protected critical components and crew positions from battle damage. However, the incident of All-American 3 exceeded even Boeing's most optimistic expectations for aircraft survivability. The company would subsequently use detailed analysis of this incident in training materials for new engineers, demonstrating concretely the critical importance of redundancy and deliberate over-engineering beyond minimum requirements. "Build it stronger than it absolutely needs to be" became an unofficial company motto, because someday, somewhere, someone's life would depend entirely on that extra strength margin. The production statistics of the overall B-17 program remain absolutely staggering, even when judged by modern standards. At peak production levels, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega combined were completing 16 complete B-17 bombers every single day. The enormous workforce included thousands of women, the famous Rosie the Riveters, who had never worked in any manufacturing environment before the war. Yet these workers achieved quality control standards that would be challenging today, even with sophisticated computer-controlled machinery. Over the subsequent decades, the story of All-American 3 has inevitably accumulated multiple layers of myth, legend, and outright exaggeration. Various retellings have added dramatic elements that simply never occurred. Some versions claim the crew used parachute cords to physically hold the plane together. Others insist they completed their bombing run after the collision occurred. Some place the incident over the English Channel rather than North Africa. Some claim the tail gunner was somehow rescued mid-flight. These embellishments, while certainly dramatic, actually diminish and cheapen the true achievement. The reality, thoroughly verified by extensive contemporary documentation, crew member testimony, and photographic evidence, requires absolutely no exaggeration whatsoever. 10 men flew a catastrophically damaged aircraft for 90 continuous minutes and 150 miles to reach safety. They accomplished this through exceptional skill, unwavering determination, and seamless teamwork. They did it without losing a single crew member. They did it in an aircraft that had absolutely no business remaining airborne, but somehow forgot to fall from the sky as physics demanded. Ralph Burbridge, the bombardier who dedicated considerable effort during his later years to correcting the historical record and dispelling myths, understood this fundamental truth perfectly. "The true story is amazing enough exactly as it happened," he stated in his final recorded interview. "We don't need to manufacture things or add dramatic flourishes. What actually happened that day was impossible according to everything we knew, but we did it anyway. That's the story that deserves to be told accurately and completely. The 414th Bombardment Squadron would fly a total of 178 combat missions throughout World War II's duration, losing 85 aircraft and hundreds of trained aircrew members. But absolutely no story from their entire combat record matched All-American 3 for sheer impossibility and dramatic impact. The incident became an integral part of squadron identity and culture, a touchstone story that defined what they were capable of achieving under the most extreme circumstances. The squadron's new emblem, directly inspired by the incident, depicted a small puppy praying while positioned atop an aircraft's tail section. The deliberate choice of a puppy rather than a more traditionally martial symbol reflected the youth of the aircrew members. Most were in their early 20s, simultaneously vulnerable in the face of enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, yet capable of extraordinary courage. The praying attitude suggested both hope for survival and the divine intervention that many crew members genuinely believed had saved All-American 3 from certain destruction. Veterans of the 414th Squadron would gather for unit reunions decades after the war's conclusion, and inevitably someone would retell the legendary story of February 1st, 1943. Men who had flown their own harrowing missions, who possessed their own personal stories of survival against overwhelming odds, would listen with respectful attention to the tale of the bomber that adamantly refused to die. Today, only a small handful of B-17 flying fortresses remain in airworthy condition, maintained by dedicated organizations and volunteers committed to keeping the memory of these aircraft alive for future generations. When these historic aircraft appear at air shows and public events, elderly veterans and aviation enthusiasts gather to see them, to hear the distinctive sound of those Wright Cyclone engines, to remember and honor those who served. The story of All-American 3 is told at these gatherings, usually by someone who personally knew someone who was there or who has studied the incident in exhaustive detail. Young people often listen initially with understandable skepticism. Surely the story must be exaggerated. No aircraft could actually survive that level of damage. Then they see the authenticated photograph, read the original crew testimonies, examine the technical analysis reports. The skepticism transforms into amazement and respect. The aircraft herself is long gone, scrapped in 1945 after giving absolutely everything she had to give over years of faithful service. But her story endures permanently in museums, in history books, in the fading memories of an ever-dwindling number of World War II veterans. She has transcended being merely an aircraft to become a powerful symbol of American industrial capability, of aircrew courage under impossible circumstances, and of the sometimes inexplicable nature of survival in warfare. In his final interview before his death in 2013, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge was asked what message he wanted to leave about All-American 3 for future generations. He thought carefully for a long moment before responding. "They were just doing their jobs," he said. "That's what people today absolutely need to understand. They weren't heroes in their own minds. They were simply young men, far from their homes, doing a difficult job that needed doing. The airplane was built by other people doing their jobs, building the best bomber they possibly could. When they got hit, everyone aboard did their job. Kenny flew the aircraft. The gunners watched for additional fighters. He helped with navigation. Sam crawled out of the endangered tail section. The miracle wasn't just that they survived against all odds. The miracle was that thousands of people, from the factory workers who built their plane to the ground crews who patched her up afterward, all did their jobs well enough that when absolutely everything went catastrophically wrong, they still had a fighting chance. That's the American way, everyone doing their part. And sometimes, when you need it most desperately, it all comes together and actually works. They flew home in an airplane that couldn't fly, landed a plane that couldn't land, and walked away from what should have been their grave. If that's not a genuine miracle, then I don't know what possibly could be.